Chapter 1. Gertrude Miller hurriedly added some fried chicken and potatoes onto a plate before spooning green beans beside them. She did the same to a second plate and carried both out to the dining room of the diner in Beckham, Massachusetts, where she'd been working since she finished school. She rushed past a table with someone familiar sitting there, but she didn't have time to stop and think about who it was. No, the table she was serving had made it very clear they wanted their food quickly. She put the plates on the table and smiled at the two men whom she knew worked at the bank just 2 doors away. "Can I get anything else for you, gentlemen?" The two came in every single day, praising her cooking, but never making eye contact. Both of them shook their heads, carefully not looking at her, but Trudy was used to that. She was a member of the infamous demon horde after all, and no one was going to accidentally show interest in her. It was frustrating that she couldn't live down her youth. Trudy walked to the table she'd passed before. "What can I get for you?" The man looked at her then, and she realized he was George, a boy she'd had a crush on in school. He smiled. "Hi, Trudy. Have you met my wife?" Trudy felt her heart fall in her chest. "No, I haven't. I hadn't even heard you were engaged." Not that anyone would tell her anything like that. She was an outcast. "Yeah, your family isn't exactly invited to a lot of public gatherings." He shrugged, looking over at his pretty little wife. Trudy was part of something we all called the demon horde. Her brothers and sisters would do anything to pull a prank. I remember one time her brother came up to me and offered me 50 cents to kiss her. I ran the other way. His wife, a pretty little blonde, looked at Trudy with a superior look and giggled. Trudy gave a tight smile. "That's me. The girl who needs to pay someone to kiss her. Do you know what you want?" All she could think about was escaping. She was mortified with the conversation. After they'd ordered, Trudy all but ran back to the kitchen. The other person working that day was the waitress, but Trudy usually tried to help out. As tears fell, she mumbled, "I'm going to stay in the kitchen today." She knew she couldn't go back out to the dining room. Not after what George had said and the way his oh-so-perfect wife had looked at her. Barbara put her arm around. "You okay?" Trudy nodded, swiping at the tears with her sleeve and settling in to cook some more. There was no way she was going to go out into the dining room ever again. Or at least until her tears had dried. Asterisk. Douglas Charleston walked into his house after a long day out on the ranch. He was dog-tired, and he didn't want to do anything but eat a hot supper and fall into bed for a week. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to ease his aching muscles. Instead, he walked into the house he'd built with his own 2 hands and sighed. No one was going to cook for him. If he wanted to eat, he'd have to scrounge something up for himself, and he hated cooking. He walked to the icebox and looked inside, and there was nothing but the milk and eggs he'd collected that morning. He sighed, not wanting to eat eggs for supper again, but it was pretty much the only thing he could cook. If you didn't count the shells. When he cooked eggs, there were always shells. He started a fire in the stove, and then put a skillet on it. He was pretty sure it was okay to cook in, because he'd made eggs in it just that morning. Why would he wash it when he made the same thing in it over and over? When he cracked the eggs, he did a little better than usual, only getting a few small shells in the frying pan. While he ate, he looked at the newspaper he'd picked up in the nearest town, flipping through it to read a bit. Not that he much cared what was happening in the world around him. His heifers had started calving, and that meant he was too busy to figure anything out. He was just finished eating when he spotted an advertisement for mail-order brides. He thought for a moment before grabbing paper, pen, and inkwell. He dipped his pen and carefully wrote a letter asking for a bride. Hopefully, by the end of summer, he wouldn't be having to cook for himself at all. He didn't really care to have a wife. He just wanted the meals she could make. Why, he shouldn't call her a wife at all. She was mail-order meals to him. Asterisk. Trudy had been thinking for weeks about what she should do about still being labeled one of the demon horde, and she'd finally come to a conclusion. She needed to see Elizabeth, her big sister, and get her to find her a husband. She was 21 already. Why, by her age, her ma had already had 5 children. She would never find a man in their area of Massachusetts, and though she enjoyed her job, she loved the idea of only cooking for one man for the rest of her life. It was a Wednesday in April when she walked to town, letting her family think she was off to work, but instead she went to Elizabeth's house on Rock Creek Road. When she arrived, she went to the door and smiled at her brother-in-law, Bernard, when he invited her in. "Where's Elizabeth?" she asked. She was always a little intimidated by Bernard, though she wasn't certain why. He was a handsome man, but he seemed dangerous somehow. In her office. Bernard would have taken anyone else to Elizabeth's office, but she was family. She knew where her sister worked. Trudy nodded and hurried down the hall, not bothering to knock as she walked into her sister's office, which doubled as a parlor. "Elizabeth, I need you to marry me off to someone. I'd rather stay close to home, but I can't wait another minute. Put me on a train this afternoon. Please." Elizabeth's grin told Trudy she'd been slightly melodramatic in her declaration, but she wasn't going to let it worry her. "I do think I have a letter for you. I was going to show you at Sunday dinner, but I can see you're not interested in waiting." "Not at all. Please tell me he wants his wife delivered immediately." Trudy plopped down on the sofa in a way she could only do with family. There was no point in her pretending to be a lady around Elizabeth. She certainly knew better. "Let me see the letter." Elizabeth giggled. "You're really ready, aren't you?" She flipped through a pile of correspondence on her desk, finally choosing one of the letters there. "I am. Can I leave Friday? Saturday? This afternoon?" Instead of responding, Elizabeth handed her sister a letter. Trudy unfolded the paper and read it carefully. "To whom it may concern. I'm hungry. I've been living alone on a ranch just outside Coyote, Colorado for years, and I've been cooking for myself all that time. Or you could say, I've been botching the meals I try to make. So far, I've mastered scrambled eggs, but only if I don't mind shells in them. I've ruined a few pans trying to make bacon. I can't keep existing on jerky and eggs. I swear I'm going to go insane if someone won't marry me. I'm including a bank draft to cover her train ticket and the cost of travels, as well as your fee. Please, by all that's holy, send me a woman who can cook. I don't care what she looks like. I don't care if she is 20 years older than me. I'm 26, by the way. I don't even care if she can't sew or clean. As long as I'm fed, I'll be happy with her. Please don't bother to write back. I want my mail-order meals immediately. Sincerely, Douglas Charleston, the hungriest man in all of Colorado, and probably the entire United States of America. P.S. Please make sure she can cook." Trudy stared at the letter before a smile slowly grew. He has a sense of humor. I want this one. She knew she could fulfill his requirements, because she happened to be an outstanding cook, but more than that, she thought he just might be what she needed. Someone who knew how to laugh. "Are you sure you know how to cook?" Elizabeth asked. Trudy stuck her tongue out at Elizabeth, realizing her siblings really did bring out the worst in her. "I've never gotten eggshells in my scrambled eggs." Elizabeth was consistently called the worst female cook in their family, and Trudy knew she was just teasing. That wasn't to say Elizabeth wasn't a good cook, because she was. They were simply from a family full of good cooks. Elizabeth grinned. "He sent more than enough money to send you out as soon as you want to go. I don't think this afternoon is reasonable, but you could go tomorrow afternoon. Then you'd have time to say goodbye to the family." Trudy tilted her head to one side. "It's Wednesday. How about I leave Friday? I'll go talk to Melvin after I leave here. I've got money saved, so I can buy some fabric and work on the train. Does he say how far he is from the nearest train station? Oh, and who is going to meet me at the station if I go right now? Was it even feasible for her to go before the man was notified? Elizabeth knew all these things about mail-order brides, but Trudy didn't. Elizabeth shrugged. You could probably hire someone to take you out to his house. I've had brides do that before. I would say find the church in town and ask someone to take you to see him. He said the town is a whistle stop only. Trudy knew that a whistle stop was a place where they stopped for a short while for people to get on and off. I could do that. I'm going to hurry and talk to Mel. He deserves as much notice as I can give him. Yes, he does. All right. You go home, tell the family, and get everything ready. Stay here on Thursday night, and I'll make sure you have a train ticket for Friday afternoon. Trudy bit her lip. Make it Saturday. Then I can work tomorrow and Friday and not feel so guilty about leaving poor Mel high and dry. She'd been working for Mel for so long, it almost felt like she was betraying him by moving away and leaving her job. Sounds smart. You just show up with what you're taking, and you're welcome whenever you want to come stay. As Trudy left to go talk to the owner of the diner, she had a little skip in her step. That hungry guy wouldn't know anything about the demon horde, and he wouldn't know what hit him. Asterisk. Trudy's mother wasn't at all surprised when she told her she was marrying a man in Colorado. I'm going to have children to visit in every state and territory, once I get done raising the ones left at home. She seemed sad, but understanding at the same time. Of course, she'd been down the road of sending a daughter off to marry before. Trudy smiled happily. You will. I hope you'll come soon. I can't say soon, but I will come. Her mother got to her feet. Now let's go look at what you have to take with you, and I'll help you pack. Trudy and her mother worked side by side, packing up an old carpet bag that had been left in a closet. Little Ida May, Trudy's youngest sister, hurried into the room with them. Where's Trudy going? She asked, her eyes wide. Trudy smiled at her sister. I'm going to go to Colorado and marrying a rancher there. Ida May wasn't born yet when Susan had gone away to marry a newspaperman in Texas, but she'd ended up marrying a rancher. I don't want you to go. You're my favorite sister. I'm too old to keep sharing a room with my little sisters, Trudy said. So, I'm going to go and be someone's wife. I'm sure you'll do the same someday. If you don't stay, I'm going to put a toad in your bed. Ida May yelled. She stomped her foot, and Trudy thought it was almost comical. Trudy just laughed. A toad wouldn't bother her. She'd put plenty into Elizabeth and Susan's bed. They wouldn't be a problem at all. I love you, Ida May, and I'll write to you every week. Ida May stomped her foot and ran from the room. Trudy sighed. That girl is almost enough to make me feel bad. You can't let this make you feel badly, Trudy. It's time for you to be married with children of your own. Trudy nodded, putting all of the little things she'd made over the years into a box. She'd have to purchase a trunk, and she was glad she'd worked so long. Thanks, Ma. I love you. I love you too. Asterisk. Trudy spent Thursday and Friday nights with Elizabeth, making sure she could easily get to work early. Her boss wasn't taking it well that she was leaving, which made it so Mel would have to work in the kitchen again. He was rather ornery when he had to cook, and Trudy was happy to be leaving. No one wanted to work when Mel had to cook. On Saturday morning, Bernard and Elizabeth drove Trudy to the train station, leaving the baby with his nanny. Trudy's trunk was in the back, and she couldn't lift it herself, so Bernard helped her with it. Just before she hurried to get on her train, Elizabeth reminded her that if she got to Colorado and Douglas was hurtful in any way, she had to remember she had somewhere to go. Trudy smiled. I know I do. I have many places I could go. She hugged her sister tightly. I hope to see you again one day. Make sure you write often, Elizabeth said, wiping away a tear. I do this often, but not with my own sisters. With you, it's so much harder. Trudy sniffled back a tear. All right. I'll write a lot. And with those words, she hurried away to board the train. Finding a seat, she smiled at an older woman beside her. Where are you headed, dear? The woman asked, seemingly eager to start a conversation to help pass the time. I'm going to build a new life. One that will be all mine, where no one will remember the misdeeds of my youth. Trudy was unaware of how very solemn she sounded as she spoke. The older woman laughed softly. Oh, dear. I'm sure there are so many misdeeds left in your youth. Don't pack them all away now. Thankfully, the woman sat beside her all the way to Chicago, where Trudy had to change trains. There were long days of talking and laughing together. Trudy would always be thankful that the older woman had helped her pass the time and keep her mind off what she was about to do. I promise I'll write to you, Mrs. Madison. Mrs. Madison smiled and nodded. I'll look forward to those letters, dear. There was no one to chat with on her next train, but Trudy took advantage of a 2-hour stop in a small town in Kansas where she found a place that sold baths. She wouldn't be perfectly clean when she reached Colorado, but hopefully she wouldn't smell like she'd been on a train for far too long. She boarded the train again, feeling clean. It was a good feeling after so long aboard a train, but unfortunately, the others on the train hadn't taken advantage of the opportunity to bathe. There was a new young woman across from her, and Trudy was pleased. Where are you headed? She asked. Someone to while away the time with was all Trudy wanted in life at that moment. The young woman smiled softly. I'm going to San Francisco. My parents are there. I just finished school. That's wonderful. I can talk to you until we reach my stop in Colorado. Trudy pulled out the new dress she was working on. What's your name? Leah Townsend. You? I'm Gertrude Miller, but please, call me Trudy. The two chatted and slept all the way into Colorado. When the conductor called out that the next stop was Coyote, Colorado, Trudy began gathering her things. Her trunk was in a storage car at the back of the train, but that was just fine. Someone would unload it for her, and then she would find a way to go and see her future husband. She hugged Leah goodbye, promising to write. She'd collected new friends to write to everywhere she'd gone. Once she was off the train, she had the man in charge of luggage put her trunk on the platform, and she looked around to see if she could spot a church. The town was small and mostly quiet, but she saw a steeple. She hurried over to the ticket window and asked the man she found there to watch her trunk. He was doing little else other than reading something, so he nodded. Sure. But if I get too busy, you're on your own. Trudy said nothing as she walked away from the man. Too busy, indeed. He was obviously occupied with what he wanted to do instead of what he should do. Men like that always irked her. She walked toward the church, as Elizabeth had instructed, and when she arrived there, she saw a parsonage attached to the church. She went there instead of to the church, expecting to find the preacher and his wife at their home. She knocked on the door and a middle-aged woman answered. May I help you? I'm here to marry Douglas Charleston, but I could use some help finding him. Trudy worried that she sounded crazy, asking the woman to help her find the man she was supposed to marry. Who did that? The older woman frowned. Does he know you're coming? He knows someone is coming, but he doesn't know it's me. Let's go find someone to run you out to the ranch then. The woman stepped outside, closing her door behind her. What's your name? Gertrude Miller, but friends and family, of which I hope you'll soon be a member, call me Trudy. It's nice to meet you, Trudy. I'm Althea Goldman. My husband is the pastor at the church. I'm sure we'll see you because Douglas is there every week. I do think he only comes because he wants to share in the potluck we have after our Sunday service, but my husband is pleased that he makes the journey anyway. He did seem rather hungry in his letter, Trudy said. I was a cook back in Massachusetts, so I hope to be able to cook fast enough to keep up with his rather alarming hunger. Mrs. Goldman laughed merrily. I believe you'll do just fine with a man. She turned and walked into the mercantile. Well, speak of the devil himself. She nodded to a man and whispered to Trudy, that's Mr. Charleston. Oh, wonderful. Trudy had never stood on ceremony, which wasn't surprising for a member of the demon horde, so she marched right up to the man. I'm your mail-order bride, or mail-order meals, as the case may be. She hadn't planned on speaking to him so flippantly as soon as she met him, but it did seem appropriate. Nice to meet you, Meals, he said, his eyes sweeping up and down her. You sure you know how to cook? I said I didn't need a young or pretty wife. You're both. He looked very skeptical of her being able to meet his specifications. I was a cook in a diner in Massachusetts, and I assure you, I never had one complaint about the food I served. She felt like she was being weighed and measured, and she didn't like the feeling much. Why didn't he just sweep her into his arms and kiss her or something? That's good. He shrugged, looking over at Mrs. Goldman. Your husband up for a wedding? Mrs. Goldman nodded as if young women went to her every day, searching for the fiancé they had yet to meet. He'll be ready as soon as I tell him there's a wedding to perform. Sounds good. He looked back at Trudy. Store's about to close. We'll be there in half an hour. I need my little bride here to show me what she needs me to buy so she can make the meals I need. He narrowed his eyes at Trudy. What's your name, anyway? I thought you'd just call me Meals, Trudy said, wrinkling her nose at him. Well, I could, but I probably want to know your real name at some point. He obviously wasn't bothered by the idea of calling his future wife by that ridiculous nickname. I'm Gertrude Miller, but my friends call me Trudy. All right, Meals. Trudy shook her head and walked past the man as she chose ingredients for the meals she planned to make. He was just sarcastic enough that she liked him. He'd make a good husband. She was sure of it. Chapter 2. Doug leaned against the counter of the mercantile, watching as his spunky little bride ran around purchasing everything she thought they would need. She stopped once in the middle of her buying frenzy. Do you have good pots and pans at home? I know you ruined several with bacon, though a grown man should certainly be able to fry up a couple strips of bacon. He shrugged, not at all uncomfortable with her question. I do have good pots and pans at home. Every time I ruin something, I buy another one. Why wouldn't I? Because you might consider it wasteful to keep ruining pots and pans? Nah. I'm helping the local economy, right, Hank? He asked the owner of the mercantile. Oh, yes. You've helped my income a great deal. You buy more food than anyone else, and more pots than 6 families would need. No need to worry about my store going under. Trudy shook her head and rushed away, again choosing different ingredients and placing them on the counter. She called out, "You picky," as she added a jar of pickles. If it is edible, I'll eat it. I eat food that's not edible all the time. Trudy sighed loudly, but she kept shopping. What about curtains? And a tablecloth? Do I need to sew for this house of yours? Doug grinned at the question. Depends on how important tablecloths and curtains are to you, I guess. He'd never even thought of caring about curtains. Why would he? The sunshine lit the house during the day. Does that mean you don't have those silly things in your home? She asked, looking at the fabric display. Yup. He was surprised to find himself liking this woman. He'd expected an older woman with buck teeth, but instead he'd gotten himself a beautiful little woman. And she said she could cook. He only hoped she was right. When she had finished all the shopping she had to do, she had a small mountain in front of her on the counter. "He's paying," she said, jerking a thumb toward Doug. He shook his head, walking to the counter and having his friend charge the amount. "I'll pay you when we come to church Sunday. I didn't think to bring that much into town with me today, and the bank is already closed." Who knew having a wife could be so expensive? He tried not to care. She meant food. "That's no problem," Hank replied, obviously trying to keep the grin from his face. "I hope you brought your wagon." Doug nodded. "I did. I was planning to try and cook again." Hank shook his head. "I'm glad we won't need to be on constant alert for a fire at the ranch any longer." Trudy gave Doug a scathing look. "You hungry?" "I'm always hungry. I'm not cooking for you unless you stop to get my trunk on the way out of town." Trudy wasn't about to leave everything she'd worked on since childhood to take into marriage with her. "No problem there. Do you keep aprons in there? I hear women like to wear aprons when they cook." Trudy sighed. "Yes, I do have aprons in my trunk. As well as other things that are dear to me." Hopefully the man would eventually think about something other than his stomach. Doug loaded his arms with the items he'd purchased and walked toward the door. "Am I going to be dear to you?" "Depends on how demanding you are about your food. I'm a good cook, and I promise to feed you at regular intervals. As long as you don't annoy me." He stopped walking and stared at her for a moment. "You'll feed me anyway." "That's what wives do." He knew there was no way he could avoid annoying her. He'd been told his entire life that he was annoying. Surely, he wouldn't be able to hide it from her. "We'll see." He put all of their purchases in the wagon parked right in front of the store. "There, now let's go get hitched." "You make it sound like I'm the other half of a team of oxen." Trudy wasn't sure what to make of Douglas now that they'd met. He seemed a little odder than she'd expected from his letter. His letter had been filled with humor, but now that she was with him, that humor seemed over the top. "We'll work together. I bet eventually we'll even be good at it." He held his arm out to her, and she took it, wondering if he was going to annoy her every day for the rest of her life. "Mrs. Goldman says you're a regular churchgoer, but she suspects it's because of the potluck they have after church every week." Trudy wanted to know where he stood with God, and that seemed a good way to find out. "Figured that out, did she?" Doug grinned. This little lady amused him more than he'd expected. "I go to church to worship God, but I happen to really love the food they serve as well." "There's nothing wrong with that, is there?" "Not if you really are going for the right reasons, and not so you can get free food every week." Surely he wasn't so hungry that he would go to church just for a good meal. "Free? I always slip money to whoever makes the best dish to pay for my share of the food." Trudy stopped walking and frowned at him. "Do you really?" He nodded. "It inspires all the ladies in town to do their best cooking." "I'm not sure how I feel about that." "Oh, you'll be glad of it if you're the one with the best cooking. You could spend the money on anything you wanted." "I'm not terribly worried about that," Trudy said. "I had a job, and I still have money from it. I'm not going to be dependent on your goodwill for the things I want and need." If she wanted a new dress, then she wouldn't go to him for money. Instead, she'd use her own money and buy it if she wanted to. "Glad to hear it. I like independent women. They have the most sass." Doug didn't have to look at her to see she was shocked by his statement. "And you think sass is a good thing in a woman?" Her brothers had always told her that her sass would keep her from ever finding a man. "I never really thought about it, but as I was picturing the woman who would come and be my mail-order meals, I thought she'd be in her 40s, unable to tie her apron strings, and plain-looking." "You're anything but." "I guess I'm glad that I got sassy you instead of the meek woman I expected." He was mostly glad anyway. He was still a little worried that she'd be more work than he'd bargained for, but he had no right to complain. "Well, isn't that nice?" They'd reached the parsonage, and she reached out to knock, but he caught her hand. "What?" "I don't want to kiss you for the first time with the pastor and Mrs. Goldman watching. How about we try a kiss now?" He hadn't expected to even want to kiss his bride, but little Miss Sassy Pants made him want a lot more than he'd expected to want. She sighed, looking at him. "I've never even kissed a man, Mr. Charleston. We can't wait another 5 minutes so I can say I was never kissed before my wedding? You can still say you weren't kissed until your wedding day." He didn't wait for her to argue with him more, but he instead lowered his head to hers and kissed her softly. He didn't try to deepen the kiss, but he just enjoyed the feel of her against him. Now, he suddenly didn't feel the need to have a talk with her about not doing anything that could bring children into their lives. Instead, he was anxious for the wedding night. Whether he was ready for children or not, he was definitely ready for a real marriage. When he raised his head, he saw a dazed look in her eyes, and he couldn't help but grin. He didn't know how it had happened, but that mail-order bride agency had managed to send a girl who could stand up to him, and who he wanted in his life. "We should probably get married," he said, startling her out of her reverie. She blinked. "Yes, of course." She turned and knocked on the door, trying to calm her racing heart. The hungry man beside her certainly was more interesting than she thought he'd be. Mrs. Goldman opened the door and smiled at Trudy. "Are you sure you still want to marry this man?" she asked. Trudy nodded. "Well, not really sure, but I came here to get married and to cook, so I don't think there's much of a choice." "Well, there are plenty of unmarried men in the area. Would you like to stay with us for a few days and meet them all? Then you can make an educated choice." Trudy looked at Doug and smiled. "I think that could be fun." Doug shook his head. "No way, no how. I'm marrying her right now, before she meets all the other unmarried men in town. There's no need for her to even think about those men. She came here to marry me. And he was keeping her no matter what that took." Mrs. Goldman laughed. "I thought you'd react that way." She opened the door wide to let the young couple inside, calling out for her husband. "We have a wedding." Pastor Goldman was not what Trudy expected at all. While his wife was rather tall and large in every other way, the good pastor was a small man. Not much taller than Trudy herself, and he was slender. The two of them looked odd together. He walked into the room and smiled at Doug, reaching out to shake his hand. "Your meals finally got here, did she?" "She did. And she's sassy. I like that in a woman." Pastor Goldman laughed. "I'm glad you're pleased. Now, shall we proceed?" The wedding was over minutes later, and Doug was told to kiss his wife. He'd been waiting for those words. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, trying to brand her as his own. The other men in town had better not even look at her, because she was his from that day forward. As they left the parsonage, Doug frowned. "Are you going to have time to make supper tonight?" Trudy wanted to roll her eyes, but it seemed a rather juvenile response. "I'll have time if you're okay with something simple. I could make crepes or pancakes or even eggs and bacon." "I'll have pancakes." He rubbed his stomach in anticipation. "Make about double what you think I'd eat," he said. "As long as you stop and get my trunk first," Trudy responded. There was something about the man that made her want to kiss him and kick him all at once. She wasn't certain what the appropriate response was, so she did neither. At the train station, her trunk was in the middle of the platform, and the ticket taker was eating at his post. "Thank you for watching my trunk for me," she said. She tried very hard to keep the sarcasm out of her voice. The man shrugged. "I didn't really pay any attention to it. I was busy." Trudy watched as her new husband hefted the trunk onto one shoulder and then put it in the back of the wagon. What do you have in this thing? Rocks? Books, and many things I have collected over the years. Trudy walked around and waited for him to help her into the wagon, and she was pleased when he actually did. The man seemed to have the manners of a mule, so it was good to have him offer her basic courtesy. She sat in the wagon, wondering why she didn't feel different. She was married now, and her life would never again be the same. It should have made her feel entirely different, but instead, she just felt like herself. As he drove, he pointed out different things along the way. "How far is it?" she asked when they were only about 5 minutes out of town. "Only another 10 minutes or so." "I'm not far out, but you don't have to be far from a city to have enough space to ranch in an area like this." Sounds good. And it did to Trudy. She could probably walk or ride into town without it causing problems. "Do you mind if I go into town alone for supplies if I need to?" He shrugged. "It'd be easier if you just had me take you when you need them." "How would you get them back without the wagon?" "I know how to hitch up a wagon and drive it," she said softly. Of course, she knew how. She was a farm girl at heart. "I grew up on a farm, and I can ride, milk a cow, collect eggs, and cook you a meal that will make you wonder how you ever lived without me." He looked over at her, taking his eyes from the road for a moment. "You're that confident of your cooking?" "For the past 5 years, I have cooked for a diner in Beckham, Massachusetts. I have only been out of school for 3 years, but the 2 years previous, they had me working evenings and weekends. There was never one complaint about the cooking." "What do you know how to make?" he asked. His mouth was already watering as he thought of all the groceries she'd piled onto the counter. He was going to be eating like a king. "I have a book of recipes from my family, and I have many other things memorized. I can follow any recipe." "Fried chicken? Pot roast? Chicken and dumplings? What about cakes and pies?" Trudy shook her head. "I know you've been eating at least once per week. How can you act like you're starving?" She could tell that he was a man who wouldn't care if she never cleaned. He'd only care if she didn't cook for him. "It's super easy. I went into town today for crackers. Now, I like crackers, but not for every single meal. Honestly, I don't care what you cook as long as it doesn't get burned." He pulled the wagon onto a dirt road. "This is my property for as far as the eye can see in every direction. If you hurry, you can put a kitchen garden in, and you'll be able to can in the fall." "Is it going to be a full-time job just keeping you fed, Douglas?" "Oh, call me Doug. And yes, it probably will be a full-time job. I love to eat." He stopped the wagon in front of a 2-story white house with a beautiful wrap-around porch on the front. She couldn't wait to sit on that porch and rock, but she didn't see a rocker. She'd have to talk to him about that as soon as she got a chance. "I'll want to eat at 6, noon, and 6. And if you feel like it, you could always send me with extra food for my saddlebags. I promise, I will not leave it to go bad. I can easily cook those meals for you, and I will try to start a kitchen garden. As long as you don't need fresh bread every single day, it should be easily manageable." Day-old bread was just fine in her opinion, but she didn't know if he would care if it wasn't as fresh as bread baked that day. "On the days you make bread, you'll make enough for the next day as well, right?" he asked, looking concerned. "Yes, of course. You're not going to go hungry as long as there is food for me to cook." She wasn't sure how often she'd have to reassure him about that, but she had a feeling it would take as much of her time as cooking for him did. He helped her down from the wagon. "I'll bring everything inside while you look around. And then, while you cook, I'll gather eggs and milk the cow." He rubbed his stomach. "I can already taste it." "You don't even know what I'm making," she protested. He leaned down and kissed her cheek. "As long as it's food, I'll be a very happy man." She shook her head and went into the house. The front door opened into a main room, which had a table and chairs. Off to the left, she saw a small parlor with a sofa and some overstuffed chairs. She walked straight ahead and found the kitchen. For a man who couldn't cook anything, his kitchen was a cook's dream. There was a water pump right there in the kitchen, and he had a nice stove. In fact, it seemed to be the same kind she'd used at the restaurant. There was even a nice, big icebox. Just perfect for keeping leftovers, if she ever had any, and meats. She couldn't wait to start cooking. Rolling up her sleeves, she wished she had her trunk, so she could put an apron on, but she was ready to change anyway. She was making herself a new dress, and it was almost done. Tomorrow, she'd have to make bread and start on the kitchen garden. Then the next day would be laundry. "I put your trunk in my bedroom," he said when he brought her the eggs. "Up the stairs, to your right." "Do you not have a spare room for me to sleep in for the next couple of weeks?" she asked, frowning at him. "You only want me here for making meals, remember?" Doug caught her hand and pulled her to him. "I remember that I was stupid. I think I need a real wife. One who will take care of all of my comforts and not just my food." "Well, you'll have to stop calling me meals then." "I might need to do that." He kissed her quickly. "I'm going to go milk the cow." "Whatever you're making, hurry." Trudy couldn't believe the man. He acted like her teenage brothers, not like a man who was used to fending for himself when it came to meals. She dug through the box of groceries and found what she needed, quickly heating up the frying pan. Tonight, she would make a simple meal of pancakes and bacon, and he'd like it. Whether he liked it or not, he needed to at least pretend he did. Never in her life had she had a man talk quite so much about food to her. He must be an exceptionally hungry man. She mixed up the pancake batter while the bacon fried, and when he came back in with milk, he sighed contentedly. "I smell bacon in my kitchen." "Bacon?" "Yes, you do. Now go and wash your hands, and I'll have supper ready in a few minutes." "I want to watch you cook," he said softly. She shook her head adamantly. "No, you can go do something constructive while I see to your meal." From what she could see, he'd kept a relatively clean house, and she was pleased. Yes, there would be a big spring cleaning in her future, but she wouldn't have to spend a lot of time getting rid of the dust first. "Fine. But I'm going to watch you cook." "Soon." How the man had managed to make watching her cook sound like something sordid, she wasn't sure, but he had. He was truly a man who loved food. There was no doubt about that in her mind. Chapter 3. Doug hadn't eaten 2 bites of his supper before he turned to Trudy. "Will you marry me and cook for me all of my days?" His hand was over his heart, and he looked extremely earnest. "Well, I guess I don't have to worry about missing out on a marriage proposal by being a mail-order bride, do I? I'll probably get 3 meals a day for the rest of my life." "You definitely will. These pancakes are fluffier than any I've ever eaten." "How did you make them so perfect?" "I could show you, but I'm not sure it would do a lot of good," she said with a smile. "Probably not," he said through his 4th bite of pancakes. He picked up his bacon and studied it. "There's not one black spot." "How do you do it?" "I'm careful with the temperature and how long I leave the bacon on the stove. It's really not that hard not to burn things." "I used to think that," he said. "I either undercook everything or burn it to a crisp. There's no in-between in my world." He popped the bacon into his mouth and moaned aloud. "This food is all I need for the rest of my life." "Will you make this for every meal?" She took a sip of her milk, studying him over the top. "Do you have a spot cleared for the kitchen garden?" He was being ridiculous, and she wasn't going to discuss the pancakes any longer. The praise was nice, but his praise was so lavish, she knew it couldn't be true. He shook his head. "I'll plow a spot in the morning, before I head out on the range. My foreman can tell the men what to do." How many men do you have working for you? Trudy asked. A dozen or so. My foreman hires them and manages them. He and I meet once a week, and we discuss how things need to be. I have a bunkhouse for them across the ranch from here. That makes sense, she said. Will I be meeting these men? He shook his head adamantly. Never. If you were old and ugly like I'd expected, I'd have let you meet them all, but you're not, so you'll have to be sequestered away in my home where no one can see you. Trudy didn't bother to respond to that. The man was insane. She wasn't sure Elizabeth had done a good thing by having her marry him, and she would soon write her sister a letter and tell her just that. He sipped at his milk, watching her for a moment. You're sleeping with me tonight. She wanted to groan aloud. I barely know you. How can you expect me to sleep with you? It's simply not the way things should go between us. Well, I still want to sleep with you. I won't make love with you for a week, but you have to sleep with me every night, and I'll be touching you some. He hoped she wouldn't notice if he started making love with her, but she was pretty bright. It might not work the way he wanted it to. You may touch me above the neck, she said magnanimously. There's no need for you to touch anywhere else if we're not making love yet. Doug frowned at her. How about if I touch you only above the waist and only on top of your nightgown? Since I want to make love tonight, and you don't, I think we should compromise. Trudy was a bit disbelieving about the first supper conversation she was having with her husband. Her mother would be mortified. Tonight, only above the neck. We'll negotiate for where you can touch tomorrow night when the time comes. So, we're going to have to discuss my marital rights at every supper for a week? You choose to have odd mealtime conversations, Trudy. She was surprised he remembered her name and didn't call her meals. I guess I do. She had finished eating, so she stood up and cleared everything but his plate from the table. She'd made as many pancakes as would have fed 3 of her teenage brothers, and they were gone. Emptying the pot of boiling water into the sink, she pumped in just a bit of cold so it was cool enough she could put her hands in it, and she made quick work of the dishes. He brought her his plate and milk glass and then leaned against the counter, watching her work. I think I'm going to like being married. I'm glad, she said, wondering what on earth she'd gotten herself into. Are you all right with bacon and eggs for breakfast? I promise to not cook that every day, but it'll be the easiest in the morning. She'd not slept a great deal on the train, and she was exhausted. As soon as he was gone in the morning, she was going to heat water for a bath. She needed it more than she needed sleep, but she couldn't trust him not to watch her bathe if he was in the house. Bacon and eggs are fine. And don't worry if you drop a shell in. I'm used to crunchy eggs. Trudy wrinkled her nose. I think I'll do my best to avoid eggshells in the meal. Oh, good. I was hoping you would. I mean, I can eat them that way, but I prefer them without the crunch. He grinned at her. It was fun to tease his new wife. He'd have to do it more often. She shook her head. I can't believe your mother let you out of her sight. I never had a mother. I was raised in an orphanage in Orlon, New York. He shrugged. Now the orphanage matron told me that I would do well to survive a week without a keeper. She was right, you know. Trudy wasn't sure how to react to the fact that he hadn't had a mother. She had been raised in poverty, but she had always had parents who loved her. And siblings. More siblings than anyone should have to admit to having. Probably. He watched as she wiped the dishes dry and then put them back in the cabinets where she'd found them. You're going to be a good wife, aren't you? I'm going to do my very best. She smiled at him. Just give me a little time to settle in. I'll try. Doug could already tell that it wasn't going to be easy. The woman absolutely captivated him. And she could cook. There was nothing he'd needed more in his life than a woman who could cook. I'll step outside for a few minutes while you get ready for bed. Trudy looked out the window and realized the sun had set. She was probably more tired than he was, and she could tell he was a hard worker. Sleep sounded wonderful. Sounds good, she said. I'll meet you up there. She hurried up the stairs and grabbed her carpet bag, where she'd packed a nightgown. She did a quick bath from the bowl of water in his room, and then she climbed under the sheets, pulling the covers up to her neck. She was thankful for the time he'd given her, but wasn't at all certain how much longer he'd wait to join her. By the time Doug felt like she'd had enough time to settle herself into bed, he was ready to scream. He didn't want to give her time, but he figured it was the gentlemanly thing to do. That was the thing about the orphanage where he was raised. The matron had made sure that manners were pounded into every child, so they could easily fit into life outside the orphanage. He couldn't count the number of times he'd been paraded out for people who wanted to adopt, but they never chose him. When Doug arrived in his bedroom, he looked over at his lovely wife, and he realized she was already asleep. She was drooling slightly, and he had a feeling she wouldn't have allowed that to happen if she'd still been awake. He quickly undressed and climbed into bed with her, kissing her on the forehead. His amorous attentions would need to wait until she'd rested up from her long journey. While the stew cooked and the bread went through its second rising, she went upstairs and grabbed the seeds she'd brought with her from Massachusetts, and went outside. Her garden would be the best garden in all of Colorado. She planted a row of peas, another of carrots, and one of potatoes, before rushing back inside to finish lunch. The bread was ready, and she popped it in the oven as she thickened the stew. After all that, she sat down at the table for a minute, looking around her at the windows. They were as naked as she'd been that morning. She wanted curtains and a tablecloth done by Monday, and she knew she could do it. She was used to cooking 2 meals a day for 60 people. How hard could it be to cook 3 meals a day for one man? When Doug walked into the house a short while later, he found her sitting, looking around the room. "Is something wrong with the house?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not at all. I just think it would look better with curtains. And a matching tablecloth, of course. I don't know why you don't already have them." "Because I'm a man, and we don't much care about curtains or tablecloths." "That's probably it. Sit down, and I'll get lunch." Taking the bread out of the oven, she dumped it out of the pans onto the counter to cool for a moment. She ladled some stew into 2 bowls, and then she cut the bread. There was store-bought butter in the fridge, but she'd seen a churn earlier. They wouldn't be eating store-bought butter for long, because she'd always preferred to make her own. Once they were seated, and he'd prayed over the meal, they began the whole process of him eating a bite and closing his eyes to savor the taste once more. She had to wonder if he would still be that appreciative of her cooking after 50 years of marriage. Chapter 4. Trudy's afternoon was just as busy as her morning, preparing the evening meal and working in the garden. It was going to take her a couple of days to get all the plants put in, and she wondered if she should do any laundry before she was done. There wasn't really a way to not get dirt on yourself while gardening. She was happy with her day's work when she went into the house to finish up supper. Doug came in just as she was taking the pot roast out of the oven. "Wash up, and I'll put supper on the table." She needed to remember to spend some time that evening writing letters to all of her friends she'd promised them to, as well as her sisters and her mother. He washed his hands quickly, and saw that she already had a huge pot of water on the stove for the dishes that evening. He found it impressive how efficient she was with everything she did. His eyes were wide as she carried a platter full of roast beef to the table, and then she added a bowl of potatoes, and a bowl of carrots, following it up with bread, butter, and gravy. "You made all this just for supper?" Trudy put her hands on her hips. "I got a letter from a man who told me repeatedly he was hungry. I'm feeding that man. That man has had 3 good meals in a row, and he finds himself very appreciative of his pretty new wife who can cook, and apparently knows how to plant a garden." His gaze was on the roast, and he couldn't seem to stop looking at it. She was mesmerizing him with her cooking. She shrugged. I'm a farm girl. Of course, I can plant a garden. I can also take a slingshot and shoot a crow from 30 feet away, so be on your best behavior, Mr. Charleston. Trudy had always been proud of her skills with a slingshot. Well, anything that needed to be shot actually. She could use a gun and a bow and arrow very well too. He narrowed his eyes at her. Can you really do that? He'd never seen a woman who could shoot anything, and he found himself very impressed. She nodded emphatically. I can also knock an apple off a brother's head with my slingshot, but after my ma caught me doing that, I had my slingshot taken away for a week. Then I had to throw apples at people as they drove past my farm. It wasn't nearly as fun. Her brothers had actually fought to decide who could put the apple on their head to have her shoot it off. Her mother had not been at all impressed with her. He paused serving his food. Really? Oh, yeah. And I helped put a snake in a teacher's desk, tied another teacher in an outhouse and dismissed school. I'm not a woman to be trifled with. Many teachers had left in the middle of the semesters, and she and her siblings had always been blamed. To be fair, it was usually their fault. I can see that. Why did you do all those things? He asked. Oh, it was expected. She smiled sweetly. Would you like to pray for us? Sure. The look he gave her thrilled her. He knew now she wasn't some mild little housewife. She had a spirit, and she was good with weapons. Perfect. Now he knew what to expect a little better. He'd seen the sass, but this was way beyond having a sassy wife. After the prayer, he looked at her questioningly. Why was it expected? He asked. I was raised a miller, and in my town, that means being a hellion. The whole town referred to us as the demon horde. That's why I couldn't find a husband back east. Didn't you wonder why you got a wife who wasn't old, ugly, or fat, who could cook in a way that made you want to sing? Well, yeah, but... She grinned. Just know that how you treat me is how I will treat you. Plain and simple. You want good meals and a sweet wife? She's easy to get. You want burned food while you watch her eat a perfect meal? You can have her too. Can you just keep being the wife you've been so far? Doug was almost nervous that he would bring out the person she was describing to him. He wasn't the easiest person in the world to live with. If you can keep being a good husband, I certainly can. Just remember. What you give is what you get from me. Pass the bread, please. He handed her the bread, realizing only then that the food was getting cold on his plate. I will do my best to be on good behavior. I got a lot planted today, she said, acting as if she'd never threatened him. I had lots of seeds from my mother's garden in my trunk, and it was fun to make little rows with them. I can't wait to get out there and weed the garden and really get my hands dirty. I didn't think women liked to dirty their hands that way. He was realizing quickly that everything he'd expected of a wife was very different than what he'd gotten. This woman, well, she was a bit awe-inspiring. I don't mind a bit. As I said, I was a farmer's daughter. She poured gravy on her potatoes and ate a big bite. Tomorrow, I'm going to plant a few other crops, and then I'll be done for the season. We can buy canned goods in town, but I prefer to can my own when I have the time. I had to cook with canned goods in the diner, and it was never quite as good as it was from my own garden. Did you help your mother with gardens in the summers? He liked the picture in his head of a little girl following along behind her mother and dropping seeds into holes. Of course. It's part of being a good farm girl. Ma would section off her kitchen garden and there would be contests to see who could grow the biggest vegetables. Usually worked for about a month before we started to paint the cows and roll around in the dirt fighting each other. Paint the cows? Doug was getting a little more worried about her by the minute. Sure. Our cow must have been painted 4 times. I never painted her, but several of my siblings did. It was cause for celebration when she was brown for a whole summer. You do realize that's strange, don't you? We never did things like that at the orphanage. We were all well behaved. Of course, being well behaved was enforced with a razor strap to the backside. Trudy shrugged. Strange for some people. Normal for my family. So, you see, it was expected that I behave that way, and I'm one who always lives up to expectations. I'm not even sure what to say to that. Doug took a bite of the food and let the flavors wash over his tongue. But I don't care, because you are the best cook in all of Colorado. Not all of the United States? Because you did say you were the hungriest man in all the country. He grinned at her. You read my letter. It made him feel good to know she remembered the things he'd asked for when he'd first sent for a bride. Of course, I read your letter, you daft man. Why would I be here otherwise? Did you think I was just going to show up on any man's doorstep and offer to cook for him in exchange for marriage? She shook her head at him. I worry about you sometimes, Doug. You probably should, he said with a shrug. I need to write some letters after supper, she told him. I made a couple of friends on the train, and I have to write to my mother, my sister, and a former coworker. Do you plan to write all those letters tonight? She shook her head. No, I'll do a couple per night until I'm finished, and then I'll start sewing curtains and a tablecloth. Do you have a preference which I do first? She hadn't given him a choice when she'd picked out the fabric for them, but she could give him a choice of what he wanted her to make first. Not at all. I care if you cook and nothing else. She sighed. Is there anything you don't like? That I should avoid making? Nothing, he said. I'll eat anything anyone puts on the table in front of me. Except when I cook. I do have some standards. She wondered for a moment why he hadn't just taught himself to cook, but dismissed the idea. All right. I'll make food every night. As she finished eating, she carried her plate to the sink and poured the hot water in. Are you finished? He gave her a look of alarm. No. I'll need to eat lots more. Trudy shook her head. Let me know when you're finished so I can take care of the dishes then. The way he acted made it seem like he hadn't eaten in years. She knew he'd had good meals at least once a week at the potluck. Why hadn't he eaten with his ranch hands? Certainly someone must have been able to cook. I'll try. Doug refilled his plate twice more, finally leaning back in his chair and patting his belly. I think I'm done. He wanted to add, for now, but he had a feeling she wouldn't appreciate that. What's for breakfast in the morning? I thought I'd make French toast with some sausage. It was odd how she had to think ahead to every meal for him. He seemed to have a need to know what his next meal would always be. Sounds wonderful. You can cook anything you want, and I'll eat it happily. I'm getting that impression. Do you have something that's a favorite for breakfast? She asked. I'm a fan of eggs, bacon, and toast. And pancakes. And French toast. And I really like omelets. And oatmeal on cold days. Trudy cleaned off the table and quickly washed the rest of the dishes. He'd managed to eat everything on the table except half a loaf of bread. She wasn't exactly sure where he put it all, but it was gone. I'll just make whatever I'm hungry for, and I'll assume you'll like it. That's a good plan. He watched her as she finished the dishes and then wiped them dry. What all did you do today? He kept having flashes of her when she'd stood up from the bathtub that morning, and he wanted to drag her off to bed, but he knew she wasn't ready yet. I planted, baked bread, made 3 meals, took a bath, and did some general cleaning. I think I'm going to wait on laundry until I'm finished with the planting, because I've never figured out how to work in the garden without being covered with dirt when I'm finished. Her ma had been able to work outside and stay clean. Well, when her children hadn't been throwing tomatoes at one another. Doug nodded. Sounds like a good plan to me. I'm not in any kind of hurry for you to wash. Good, I'll wait then. Trudy took the paper, pen, and inkwell she had set on the counter earlier and sat at the table to write. I'm going to write a couple of letters now. He nodded, not moving. Instead, he sat at the table and watched her write her letters. Trudy had enough brothers that she wasn't even bothered. They would watch her do whatever she was doing just to annoy her. It certainly felt differently when Doug did it, but she had learned to concentrate on what she was doing and ignore her brothers. She could do the same thing with Doug. She wrote to Elizabeth, telling her how she'd found Doug and about the pleasant ride on the train. She told her sister that she had come to a truly starving man who would eat anything and everything put before him. And then she wrote to her mother and told her how happy she was there in Colorado and how there was no need to worry. Once she'd finished both letters, she set them aside and hid a yawn behind her hand. I'm going to use the outhouse and then go to sleep. I don't think I'm fully recovered from that long train ride yet. I don't blame you, Doug said. I'll wait down here until you've changed. Thank you for giving me a little time. She was truly surprised he was being so considerate while waiting for her to ready herself for bed at night. She knew he didn't want to be, and he had seen her unclothed now. Trudy used the outhouse and then passed him again. He was still sitting at the table. She wasn't sure what was on his mind, but whatever it was, it certainly seemed to occupy him well. She had a hard time sitting idle, and he seemed to have no issue with it at all. She changed into her nightgown and got into bed, closing her eyes and praying that sleep would come swiftly as it had the night before, but instead, she was still awake when Doug came to bed. She thought about feigning sleep, but she didn't like to be dishonest, so instead, she waited for him. Doug walked into the room and shed his clothes on the floor, getting into bed with her while wearing nothing. Aren't you going to wear a nightshirt? She asked, a little startled. Nah. I can't feel you against me if I wear a nightshirt, and I sure wish I could talk you out of your nightgown. It's not like I haven't seen you in your altogether. He tried to be persuasive with his tone, but he had so little experience with women, he wasn't sure he was doing it correctly. You're going to have to wait for that part of our marriage. I've told you that. But that was yesterday. I thought maybe I'd convinced you by being such a considerate husband today. She laughed softly. You're going to have to work harder than that. I'm not that easily swayed when I set my mind to something. Well, then I'll just have to kiss you a little. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her softly, wanting to do so much more than he knew she'd allow. She turned to him, wrapping her arms around his neck, and enjoyed the feel of his lips on hers. She was no stranger to the male anatomy, having had to take her turns changing diapers of her younger siblings, but she hadn't really thought a man would feel like Doug did. Her fingers toyed with the muscles in his broad shoulders, and she sank into the kiss. Doug pulled her closer, pressing himself against her. Are you sure I can't persuade you to lose the nightgown? He asked, feeling a bit desperate with her so close to him. She sighed. Not tonight. I really want to know you a little better. Perhaps we could go for a walk after supper tomorrow. She knew he didn't want to take the time to really get to know her, but it was the one thing she wanted from him. He groaned. You're going to be the death of me, Trudy. Just as you fatten me up, I'm going to die of frustration. She kissed his chin. I'm sure you'll live. I did suggest you put on a nightshirt. I'm not wearing a nightshirt in bed with my wife. It goes against everything I believe as a man. I don't believe there's anything in the Bible that would suggest a man shouldn't wear a nightshirt when he's in bed with his wife. Doug shook his head. Will you always get the best of me verbally? She nodded emphatically. Always. It's one of the lasting benefits to being a member of the demon horde. He wasn't sure how to respond to her, so he simply closed his eyes. She made him tired anyway. Trudy watched him by the light of the full moon, enjoying watching him fall asleep. Everything about Doug was perfect to her. Except maybe his warped sense of humor. She might be able to get beyond that, though. Asterisk. Trudy was able to finish her planting the following day. Doug came home for lunch, but when he saw how busy she was, he headed back out as soon as he'd finished his meal. When he came home for supper, she had fried chicken waiting on a platter, along with a mountain of mashed potatoes, green beans, and a cream gravy. "I think I'm going to like having a wife," he said as he walked to the sink to wash his hands. "It looks like you finished your planting." Making small talk about things was difficult for Doug, because he'd been raised to speak only when he had something important to say. But having a wife meant talking to her. "I did. I'll do the wash tomorrow, and then I'll give the house a good scrubbing. I'm just pleased I got it in, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get everything planted in time to have a good harvest this year. I hope you planted some pumpkins. One of my favorite things in the world is pumpkin pie." He could talk to her about food all day. He could talk to anyone about food. It was so much easier than trying to find something else to say. "I'm glad to hear it. I thought I'd take a basket when we walk tonight, and I hope to find some strawberries. There are some wild raspberries near here, and some wild cherries as well." "No strawberries?" "I was thinking of making a strawberry shortcake. I guess I'll try to gather both. I can make a cherry pie and maybe a raspberry pie." "With homemade whipped cream?" he asked as he sat down at the table. "Of course. What would pie be without homemade whipped cream?" Doug smiled as she put the chicken on the table. "That looks wonderful. Have you ever burned anything in your life?" She laughed. "I thought you wanted a wife who knew how to cook. Why are you acting like you're disappointed that I'm good at it?" Trudy had always loved to cook, learning from her mother when her mother was not working, and from her older sisters when her mother was. Susan taught Trudy a great deal before she'd moved to Texas. He shrugged. "I'm glad you can cook, of course, but I just wish you weren't good at everything." "I'm not good at everything. I'm terrible at geography." She had never been able to figure out her north from her south. "You are?" he asked. "I find that difficult to believe. Trust me, I'm bad at it. I have no sense of direction either. People would give me directions, and I'd get so turned around, I wouldn't be able to find my way to save my life." She put the last of the foods on the table and sat down beside him, bowing her head as she waited for the prayer. While they ate, she talked to him about what she'd planted, and he talked a little about his day on the ranch. "My foreman was sick today, and I sent him home right after lunch, which meant I spent the entire day working on fences with only 4 men. The others were out helping with the calves." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I desperately want to make sure none of the calves are lost this year, but that's really hard to do. Especially down one man." "How sick is he?" "I could make him some chicken soup." Trudy had often fixed chicken soup for the ailing back in Massachusetts. He grinned. "You think your cooking can fix anything, don't you?" She shrugged. "I think good food can fix anything. And if I'm the one cooking, then I know the food is good." "You're right about that. I don't think I've ever enjoyed meals as much as I have since you came here. Have I mentioned yet that I'm glad it was you and not the woman I was picturing in my mind? My sister thought I would be perfect for you. She told me so when she handed me the letter." Elizabeth was always right about those things, though none of her siblings wanted to admit it. She said she could feel who the right woman was for the letter in her hands. "Your sister?" he asked. "Yes, my sister Elizabeth. She owns the mail-order bride agency." Doug shook his head. "Did you tell me that?" She shrugged. "I didn't think it was important." "Do you?" Why did it matter if it was her sister who sent her to be his wife? If you couldn't cook and your sister sent you to marry me, I'd be pretty darned annoyed, but since you're a great cook, I'll let it slide. Trudy grinned. I'm sure Elizabeth will be very relieved you're not angry with her. She wanted to roll her eyes, but she decided that would look childish. Chapter 5. Trudy hurried as she did the dishes that night, happy that they would be going for a walk together. She grabbed a small pail for the raspberries and a basket for the cherries, handing Doug the pail to carry. I haven't really explored it all yet, she said. Normally, I would have wandered around the whole area, but since it's already June, I needed to get my garden in quickly. Let's go away from the road, he suggested. It's still my land, and I've seen both cherries and raspberries this way. He was a little disappointed that their walk together was going to turn into fruit picking, but he was thrilled that he would have the opportunity to eat the cherries and raspberries, so he was going to not worry over it too much. How far out here do you own the land? She asked. About a half-mile this way. We won't have to walk quite that far to get the fruit, though. I wouldn't mind walking the entire way, she said. I enjoy walks in the country. I walked into town every day that I could when I was back east. Sometimes when it was really cold, my father would take me, but I liked walking so much that I usually just bundled up extra good. I'm happy to walk with you whenever you want to go out. Would it be dangerous for me to walk by myself? She asked. She would always take her slingshot, of course, but she wasn't sure if there would be predators that would prevent her from being able to use it. He shook his head. Not really. There are some bears in the area, but they don't usually come this close to people. She frowned. I could take a pistol if you wouldn't mind that. I'm a crack shot. Of course, you are. Who taught you to shoot? Oh, my brothers. When I was so good with a slingshot, they decided that I needed to learn to shoot a gun. And then a bow and arrow. Then they regretted teaching me, because I can outshoot all of them. Trudy shrugged. Her brothers had been too prideful when it came to shooting practice. All right. I would not have a problem with you going alone if you took a gun with you. I think that's a good idea, in fact. Wonderful. Trudy had always preferred to walk alone, and having to wait for her husband to finish work so she could enjoy nature would have really bothered her. She'd get her work done, and then she would walk. She spotted the cherry tree just feet from some raspberry bushes. You get the raspberries, and I'll get the cherries. He frowned. To get the cherries, you'd need to climb the tree. Maybe she could shoot, but he was certain she wouldn't be able to climb a tree. No woman really could. Trudy didn't hesitate. She put the basket over her forearm and a foot on a low knot on the tree. Within seconds, she was sitting on a low branch, plucking cherries from all around her. I don't think that's going to be a problem. Doug shook his head at her. She certainly wasn't a refined lady like he'd expect her to be, but she got every job she said in front of her done. He wasn't sure if he should scold her for climbing the tree, or applaud how swiftly she'd done it. This wife of his was a confusing woman. As soon as she finished filling her basket, she called for Doug to come take it from her. I don't want to risk spilling them on my way down. He grinned as she scurried to the ground with the deftness of a squirrel. Don't tell me. Your brothers taught you to climb trees? She shook her head. Actually, no. My sisters. We built a treehouse that the boys weren't allowed into after they built one, and my father said it was fine the girls couldn't go in it, because girls were incapable of climbing trees. It made us angry, so we had to prove him wrong. He shook his head. I'm sure you're happy to be in Colorado now then. Women have had the vote here for 3 years. Most independent women he knew had wanted the vote, and they were thrilled to be able to exercise their rights as citizens. Wait, are you serious? I can vote? Trudy had never even considered voting. It was something she would have to think about and study. Of course, in the modern year of 1898, women should be able to vote. It was almost the 20th century. He nodded, enjoying the excitement on her face. Now I'm not sure I want my wife to vote, he said teasingly. She took one of the cherries from her basket and threw it at his head. Ouch. The pit was in there. He rubbed his head. And now you know to never threaten my voting privileges, don't you? Trudy was amused by the mark left on his face. She was certain it was cherry juice. At least she hoped his skin wasn't reddening from her throwing it at him. He shook his head. You didn't tell me you had good aim when throwing. No, but you knew I had good aim with a slingshot and a gun. You couldn't have questioned my throwing arm. He laughed. I shouldn't have, I guess. As soon as they arrived back in the house, Trudy sat at the table. I'm trying to decide if I want to start pitting the cherries before I go to bed. It was already dark out, and she needed to be up early to cook breakfast. I'm going to wait until morning, I think. I can work on the cherries tomorrow. I'll probably can some and bake a pie as well. Where is the handgun? And I'll go pick some more tomorrow if I have time. She loved the freedom she would have as his wife. Having a choice of where she wanted to walk and what she wanted to do was something thrilling to her. He showed her where he kept it on a shelf in the parlor. You know, I've never even been in here, she said. I guess I should have explored the whole house, but you seem to be so terribly fond of the kitchen. That's where my food comes from. How could I not be fond of it? He grabbed her by the waist and pulled her to him, surprising her with a kiss. Thank you for making me pies. She shook her head. You're going to want pies every day now, aren't you? I probably can't eat a whole one in one meal. So, make it for supper, and I'll have the other half for lunch. Do I not get pie? Trudy asked, glaring at him. Okay, you can have 2 pieces, which leaves the other 6 pieces for me. 3 for lunch and 3 for supper. She shook her head. You eat more than 3 of my brothers combined. She hadn't imagined it would be possible for anyone to out-eat her brothers. Well, I do a lot of work. I'm sure your brothers don't work as hard as I do. Trudy refused to comment on his reasoning. I'm going to bed. I'll work on the cherries in the morning, and make sure you have a pie for supper. Have I told you yet that you are the very best of wives? No, and it's probably not something you should tell me. It might go to my head. With that, she turned and hurried up the stairs to change into her nightgown. Just after she'd turned down the lantern, Doug came into the room and stripped all of his clothes off again. When he got into bed with her this time, he didn't ask for anything. He simply started kissing her and stroking his hands over her body. When he dared to cup her breast in his hand, she gasped. I don't know that I've given you that liberty yet. But it felt good. He shrugged. Sometimes a man has to take liberties whether they've been given or not. His hand stayed at her breast, rolling her nipple between his thumb and forefinger. His other hand moved down her body and cupped her bottom in his hand, pulling her against his erection. I think it's time for you to remove this nightgown. Trudy thought about refusing him, but she knew she couldn't hold him off much longer, and the truth was, she was feeling some of his passion. Her fingers went to the 3 buttons on the front of her nightgown, and she slowly undid them. He pulled her nightgown over her head, and his hands began roaming all over her naked body. I've been dying to touch you since, before I saw you naked yesterday. She smiled. You wouldn't leave. He hadn't mentioned the incident to her, and she really wondered if he'd forgotten. He laughed. And I got an eyeful. He stroked his hands over her breasts, toying with her nipples. You are so beautiful. With clothes and without. I'll do my best to keep my clothes on during the day, though. That may be for the best, he said. I'm not sure I could be working out on the range if I knew you were here with no clothes on. It would make me crazy. She laughed. I think you make yourself crazy already. You don't need me to do anything to add to it. What? As he said it, he flipped her onto her back, and his knee came up between her legs, settling at her core. "You can't talk to me that way, wife." "And who is about to stop me?" she asked. "Have you forgotten my aim?" Doug saw no other way to quiet her, so he covered her mouth with his, as one hand slid between her thighs and probed her heat. He was surprised at just how hot she was there, and he toyed with her for a moment before rolling atop her. He knew better than to take his mouth from hers, so he continued the kiss, even as he penetrated her body with his own. Trudy gasped as she felt that part of him inside her, but he swallowed the small pained sound. It wasn't long before he began moving inside her, and her feelings returned to the same fever pitch they'd been at before he had entered her. All at once, he let out a loud sound and it was over. He rolled to her side and wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. She had expected him to praise her, but instead he was snoring in her ear. It made her want to swat his shoulder, but what good would that do? She'd get her praise tomorrow. At least she would get it if he knew what was good for him. Asterisk. Trudy was up early, and she had breakfast waiting when Doug came in with the milk and the eggs. "I hope you're hungry," she said as she put a large omelet on the table in front of him, 2 pieces of toast on the side. He nodded, and prayed as soon as she was seated. "I need to get out there early today, because I don't know if my foreman is up to working again yet, and someone has to direct the men. I'm hoping for more calves today." "How many have there been so far?" she asked. "We've had 520 this spring. I was hoping for 600, but we'll see if we reach that." He ate his food as quickly as he could. "All right, I'll see you at lunch." He gave her an absent-minded kiss before heading for the door. She frowned after him. She hadn't gotten the praise she'd expected. The man needed to learn how to talk to his wife, and he needed to learn soon. He was making her crazy. After finishing the breakfast dishes, she made the dough for the bread for the day, and then heated water for the wash. She hated doing the laundry, but it was a necessary evil, and she would get it done and then not have to do it for another week. Besides, she had Doug all to herself the next day, and they would be going to church. It would be a good day. As soon as she'd hung the laundry on the line, she went in and punched down her bread, setting it in the pans to rise once more. She'd made a little extra, and she added some cinnamon and sugar to it, along with extra butter, knowing her husband's fondness for sweets, and any other food he could get his hands on. Now he'd have some dessert for his lunch. She reheated the fried chicken from the night before, and warmed up the potatoes for lunch. Now that she had a better idea of how much he ate, she was better able to judge how much he'd eat for a meal and have some left for lunch the following day. She planned to get up early the next day and make her chicken and dumplings for the church potluck. Doug had yet to try her chicken and dumplings, and she was certain as soon as he tasted them, he'd fall madly in love with her. She wasn't sure if she wanted or needed his love yet, but she'd at least make the effort. When he came in for lunch, he quickly ate everything in front of him and headed back out, saying very little to her. As she thought about it, Trudy's temper rose. Now that he'd gotten what he wanted from her, he wasn't going to talk to her any longer? What kind of man was he? She would have to tell him exactly what she thought of him when he came in for supper that night. She briefly thought about making his meal something that even he wouldn't find palatable, but after eating with him as much as she had, she knew better than trying. If he wouldn't eat it, then it wasn't worth eating. First, she baked a cherry pie. She'd whipped the cream to go with it right before serving it. Then she sat down at the table and started on the curtains she wanted to make. Most of the afternoon was spent sewing, but right before Doug was due back, she fried up the pork chops she had in the icebox and made some fried potatoes to go with them. She was just taking the potatoes off the stove when he walked in. "Supper smells good," he said, washing his hands and sitting down at the table. Trudy served the meal, and waited for him to tell her how good it was, but he didn't. He ate it like he'd been eating her cooking for 20 years. She wasn't sure what was going through his head. He was being very distant, and it bothered her a great deal. "What time do we need to leave for church in the morning?" "Around 9. "Are you planning to take something for the potluck?" he asked. "I thought I'd get up early and make chicken and dumplings. It was my most requested meal at the diner." She wanted to tell him that the dumplings would melt in his mouth, but she wanted to see his face the first time he ate them as well. "That's nice." His mind was obviously on something else, and she wanted to ask him what was wrong with him, but she wasn't sure it was her place. She was simply mail-order meals, not a real wife. He'd made that clear. Besides, if Doug wasn't up to talking about food, there was something very wrong with the world. After supper, he went to milk the cow while she did the dishes, and then she sat down and wrote a letter. He didn't watch her this time, instead he sat with ledgers in front of him. "Are you worried about money?" she asked. She had a good deal of money saved from working, so she was ready to help financially if she needed to. He shook his head but didn't say anything else, and she had to wonder again what was wrong. Something was bothering him, and she had no idea how to tell what it was. He wasn't even making silly jokes about food anymore. Had something happened? When they went to bed, he made love to her, but there was none of the teasing banter of the night before. It was as if she'd married one man, and as soon as they'd had relations, he became someone else. She lay awake long after he'd gone to sleep, wondering why he had been so distant. She didn't much like it, but she would do her best to keep pushing through. There was nothing else to do. Asterisk. Trudy was up even earlier than usual the next morning, and she took the chicken she'd boiled the previous day from the icebox and deboned it. When she was finished with that, she set the chicken pieces in the broth she'd made while cooking the chicken, and then she put it on to boil. While it started boiling, she made French toast for breakfast and fried bacon to go with it. Doug came down later than usual, going straight to the barn to milk the cows and gather the eggs. He brought them to her, and then settled down at the table, saying a prayer and starting to eat his breakfast. "Are you feeling sick?" Trudy asked, feeling as if she was grasping at straws. He shook his head. "No, I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." And that was the end of the conversation. Trudy waited a few minutes. "Anything you want to talk about?" "Not at all." He ate the last bite, and he stood up. "We'll leave for church in 2 hours. I need to check on some things before we go." She watched him leave, wondering if she'd done something to upset him. Maybe she shouldn't have thrown the cherry at him, but he'd seemed to take it in stride at the time. There was no reason for him to be ignoring her now. He returned just before they needed to leave for church, and hurried upstairs to change into clothes that weren't covered with dirt. And was that blood? She had no idea what he'd been doing, but she knew it was blood. She wanted to follow him up the stairs and ask him why he was covered with blood, but she didn't. Instead, she put a lid on her pot and carried it out to the wagon that he'd already hitched for the ride. She put the pot onto the wagon seat, and then she climbed up beside it. Even if he was going to act strangely, she was going to enjoy her first morning at the new church.